Hello, my name is Steve Adolf, and welcome to our topic, Epic User Stories, or Don't Be Afraid of the Big Story. In our topic, User Story Basics, we mentioned that user stories were something that were small, the intent being that we could deliver a thin slice through the system, a valuable slice of the system, every sprint or iteration. The intent being that we got quick feedback from the stakeholder or the product owner, and we could use that knowledge to help us know whether or not we were drifting off into the wasteful red or still in the valuable green. So the question now comes up, what happens if our user story is too big to fit into a sprint? Do we extend the sprint or the iteration? Well, the answer is no. In the Agile world, we do not extend sprints or iteration because the cadence is what gives us the regular feedback. So the alternative then is we actually have to take the story and make it smaller, or more correctly, split the big user story up into smaller stories, each of which can be implemented in a single sprint. Now the model for this is that we introduce this idea of epic user stories. And it's kind of like what you think. Epic, right? You think of the grand old movies like the Ten Commandments, right? The Cecil B. DeMille, the massive Hollywood epics. Yes, epic is the big story. And that's kind of the metaphor you might want to think of. And we can model that this way, that we have a backlog item and it's a user story, but it's too big, so we call it an epic story. And an epic story could be basically consists of two or more smaller stories, or it even could consist of two smaller epic stories. So you can begin to see here that there is a hierarchy in the user story world where we can have a big story, which can be split into a set of two or more smaller user stories, or maybe even split into smaller epics, which they themselves can be split into smaller stories. Now, for those of you who are not quite comfortable with the unified modeling language, it could look something more like this. So here is a really big epic. This is a big epic story. And it's, our teams looked at it and says, well, we can't do this in a single sprint. In fact, this is going to take us several sprints to do. This is a big feature. And the running example we've had is, of course, the upgrade seat story. That's probably not something we can do in a single sprint or iteration. So we can take that and it can be split into smaller children. So there might be a couple of user stories and there might actually be a lot of smaller epics. So we have this big story, big epic user story, and it gets split into these smaller epic stories. It also gets split into stories which we can then implement. And further, we might be able to split that further. So you can see that there is this child, parent, grandparent hierarchy that we can have with user stories. So the term epic here really just simply refers to any user story that we have to split into smaller user stories or smaller epic. Now, you may have heard different definitions of epics, and unfortunately there are a lot of proprietary definitions about epics floating out there. For our purposes, I'm just going to use the term epic user story, or just plain epic, to mean that we have a user story that is too big to implement in a single sprint. Therefore, we need to split it into smaller child stories, and even those may be epics, and they have to get split into grandchild stories and so on and so forth. Just like one point I also want to make, just like in real life, your children totally subsume you. The children here, the child story, totally subsume their parents. All of the behavior that is described in the epic story is completely subsumed by all of its children. So using that will help us develop a very nice way of refining our big stories, or our epics. Our epics can be refined by splitting them into smaller and smaller stories that give us narrower and narrower scope but become much more concrete. So taking a look at this in our backlog here, we may have a a large user story. In this case, we're going back to our toaster example, and we see we have the big user story, so it's now an epic. And what happens is that it gets split into its child stories this way. So you can see this hierarchical relationship. And again, this gives us a very nice way to manage our work and to manage the refinement of our backlog through the epic stories and their children.